On the rocky coasts and manicured lawns of America's most private shorelines, there once stood a vision that felt untouchable. White clapboard houses facing the Atlantic, wide porches catching the summer light, flags lifting gently in the breeze. These were not just family homes. They were symbols. To the public, the Kennedy estates represented a promise that power could be elegant, that leadership could be youthful, and that America itself could feel noble. This vision came to be known as Camelot. And for a brief moment in history, the country believed in it completely. But myths are not born from truth alone. They are constructed carefully, maintained relentlessly, and protected at all costs. The Kennedy estates were central to that construction. They framed photographs, hosted celebrations, and projected unity. From Hyannisport to Palm Beach, these properties told a story of confidence and destiny. They suggested a family perfectly aligned with the future, untouched by the chaos that defined so much of the 20th century. What they did not show was what it took to sustain that illusion. Behind the gates, life was governed by expectation. The estates were not places of rest. They were arenas. From childhood, Kennedy's sons and daughters learned that they were being prepared for something larger than themselves. Achievement was not encouraged, it was required. Weakness was not addressed, it was managed. The homes that appeared warm and welcoming to the outside world operated internally with discipline, hierarchy, and silence. Camelot thrived on contrast. Public joy against private strain. Sunlit gatherings against unspoken pressure. The same walls that sheltered laughter also absorbed fear, pain, and rivalry. These estates did not merely witness history. They shaped it. They created an environment where ambition could flourish, but vulnerability could not. And over time, that imbalance began to show. The American public never saw the full picture. What they saw were carefully chosen moments, children playing on lawns, brothers sailing together, parents watching proudly from shaded porches. These images became inseparable from national identity. The Kennedy homes felt like extensions of the presidency itself. They reassured a nation that power could be humane and hopeful. Yet the very isolation that preserved the myth also made it fragile. Protected from scrutiny, insulated from consequence, the family lived in a world where problems rarely reached outside correction. Inside those walls, grief was endured quietly. Pressure intensified. The cost of maintaining Camelot rose with every passing year. This is where the story truly begins, not with tragedy, but with belief. Belief in legacy, belief in destiny, belief that a family could outrun the limits that applied to everyone else. The Kennedy estates were built to house that belief, to give it shape and permanence. And for a time they succeeded, but places that hold too much meaning eventually crack under the weight of expectation. What followed was not a single fall, but a slow unraveling one that would turn homes of promise into landmarks of loss. The illusion of Camelot did not collapse all at once. It eroded quietly from within. Hyannisport was never meant to be just a vacation retreat. From the moment the Kennedy family began consolidating their presence along the Massachusetts coast, it evolved into something far more deliberate. What appeared to the outside world as a relaxed seaside compound was, in reality, the operational heart of the Kennedy dynasty. Decisions that shaped national policy, political careers, and family hierarchy unfolded quietly behind its hedges, far from public scrutiny. Hyannisport was where the Kennedys stopped performing and started controlling. The compound's power came not from its size, but from its structure. Multiple homes clustered together created a closed ecosystem close enough to enforce unity, distant enough to preserve rank. Proximity was strategic. It allowed Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. to observe, influence, and manage his family without appearing authoritarian. From morning routines to evening conversations, life at Hyannisport followed an unspoken order. Everyone knew where they stood, even if no one said it aloud. Privacy was the compound's most valuable currency. The Kennedys learned early that isolation was protection. The gates, the shoreline, the exclusivity of the neighborhood all ensured that mistakes stayed internal. Problems were addressed within the family, never outsourced. This approach created loyalty, but it also eliminated external correction. When power answers only to itself, accountability weakens. For the Kennedy children, Hyannisport functioned as a proving ground. Summers were not idle. Sailing races, athletic competitions, debates at the dinner table, everything carried an undercurrent of evaluation. Achievement was praised but never excessively. Failure was acknowledged but rarely discussed. The message was clear: resilience mattered more than recovery. This environment produced confidence, but it also cultivated emotional suppression. As the family's political influence expanded, Hyannisport transformed into an informal headquarters. Advisors visited discreetly. Strategy discussions blended seamlessly with family meals. The boundaries between public service and private life dissolved. The estate became a place where personal relationships and national ambition coexisted without separation. This fusion strengthened the dynasty's cohesion, but it also magnified pressure on individual members. The illusion of ease was carefully maintained. Photographs from Hyannisport showed smiling faces, relaxed postures, sunlit scenes. These images became part of the Kennedy brand, reinforcing the idea that leadership could be effortless. What the images concealed was the discipline required to maintain that image. Spontaneity was rare. Appearances were calculated. Even leisure carried expectation. Joseph Kennedy's influence permeated the compound long after his direct involvement diminished. His belief in legacy over individuality shaped the estate's culture. Hyannisport was not a place to discover oneself. It was a place to become what was expected. Personal desires were secondary to family objectives. This philosophy produced remarkable unity in public, but deep conflict in private. The estate's layout mirrored this philosophy. Shared spaces encouraged visibility. Private rooms were limited. Movement was observed, even informally. Nothing about Hyannisport was accidental. It functioned as a controlled environment where behavior could be monitored without overt enforcement. This subtle surveillance fostered discipline, but it also bred anxiety. As John F. Kennedy's political career accelerated, Hyannisport became synonymous with power. Journalists camped nearby. Security intensified. Yet, inside the compound, routines remained unchanged. The family resisted adaptation, clinging to familiarity as a source of stability. This resistance would later prove costly. The estate's isolation created an echo chamber. Success reinforced belief. Praise drowned out warning signs. Physical ailments were managed quietly. Emotional struggles were absorbed privately. Hyannisport became a place where vulnerability had no audience and therefore no resolution. Problems existed, but they did not evolve. They accumulated. For Jacqueline Kennedy, Hyannisport represented both refuge and constraint. She entered a family system already defined by expectation and loyalty. The estate offered protection from public intrusion, but it also demanded conformity. Individual grief, particularly later, would have to coexist with collective narrative. The needs of Camelot always came first. Children raised within the compound inherited not only wealth but scrutiny. Their behavior reflected on the entire dynasty. Mistakes were not personal. They were reputational. This burden shaped identity from an early age. Freedom existed, but only within boundaries that protected the family image. As national attention intensified, Hyannisport's role shifted subtly. It became less a home and more a symbol. Every visit carried meaning. Every photograph contributed to myth-making. The compound was no longer just shelter. It was narrative architecture. It framed the story America wanted to believe. Yet beneath this symbolic weight, the human cost grew. Constant proximity amplified conflict. Silence replaced dialogue. Emotional needs went unmet because acknowledging them threatened the image of strength. Hyannisport, for all its beauty, became emotionally narrow. The estate also normalized secrecy. Information flowed selectively. What outsiders knew was carefully curated. This habit of concealment would later extend beyond image management into moral ambiguity. When mistakes occurred, the instinct was not to confront them publicly, but to contain them privately. Hyannisport taught the Kennedys that consequences could be delayed, redirected, or softened. This lesson proved dangerous. It created a sense of insulation from reality, a belief that the family could absorb any shock without structural damage. History would prove otherwise. The compound's greatest strength, unity, also became its greatest weakness. Loyalty discouraged dissent. Respect discouraged challenge. By the time cracks appeared, the structure was too rigid to adapt. Change required vulnerability, and vulnerability had no place at Hyannisport. This section of the story is not about scandal or death. It is about formation. Hyannisport shaped the Kennedy worldview long before tragedy struck. It established patterns of control, silence, an expectation that would later magnify loss rather than mitigate it. When violence eventually entered the Kennedy narrative, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a system already strained by pressure, secrecy, and unresolved conflict. Hyannisport did not cause the tragedies that followed, but it shaped how the family responded to them, and how little room they had to heal. By understanding Hyannisport, we understand the foundation of Camelot, not as fantasy but as infrastructure. A place designed to produce greatness at any cost, unaware that the cost would eventually exceed what even immense power could absorb. The compound still stands today. Orderly and dignified, its lawns trimmed, its gates closed. To visitors, it appears timeless. But history knows better. Hyannisport was not just where the Kennedy story unfolded. It was where the rules of that story were written, and where the seeds of its tragic fall were quietly planted. The Kennedy dynasty did not emerge accidentally. It was engineered deliberately and relentlessly by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man who understood power not as a privilege, but as a system to be built, defended, and extended across generations. Wealth was only the beginning. What mattered more was direction. From the earliest days, Kennedy money came with expectation, and expectation came with pressure that would define every estate the family inhabited. Joseph Kennedy believed deeply in control, not only over business and politics, but over narrative. He understood that families who endured were not simply rich. They were disciplined. The estates became tools in that discipline. They were environments designed to shape behavior, reinforce hierarchy, and produce results. Comfort existed, but it was never indulgent. Luxury was present, but always purposeful. Every space served the larger mission of legacy. Inside these homes, childhood unfolded under constant evaluation. Competition was not introduced gradually. It was assumed. Physical strength, intellectual sharpness, charisma, these were currencies to be developed early and displayed often. Siblings were encouraged to measure themselves against one another, not out of cruelty, but strategy. In Joseph Kennedy's worldview, comparison forged resilience. What it more often forged was anxiety. Failure was tolerated only if it was temporary. Weakness was acknowledged only if it could be corrected quickly. Emotional struggle had no vocabulary. There was no framework for discussing fear, self-doubt, or exhaustion. These were considered private obstacles to be managed internally, not communal experiences to be shared. The estates, expansive and elegant, paradoxically offered little emotional space. Joseph Kennedy's presence lingered even when he was not physically present. His expectations shaped daily life, conversations, ambitions. Sons understood they were being prepared for public leadership. Daughters understood they were custodians of image and loyalty. Roles were assigned early and rarely questioned. Individual identity was secondary to family function. This pressure was normalized through routine. Meals became informal assessments. Activities became performance. Success was celebrated briefly, then replaced with new goals. The estates reinforced this rhythm. There were always people watching, always standards being upheld. Privacy existed, but solitude did not. In such an environment, introspection had nowhere to go. The wealth that insulated the Kennedys from material hardship also insulated them from corrective friction. Mistakes did not lead to consequences in the traditional sense. They led to containment. Lawyers, advisors, and allies smoothed disruptions. The estates functioned as buffers, absorbing impact before it reached the outside world. Over time, This buffering altered the family's relationship with reality. Joseph Kennedy's ambition extended beyond personal success. He envisioned a lineage that would shape American life for decades. Politics was not a career choice. It was destiny. The estates became training grounds for this destiny, places where confidence was rehearsed and authority internalized. They taught the Kennedys how to move through power without hesitation. Yet ambition of this scale demands sacrifice, and the sacrifices were rarely discussed openly. Physical health suffered under constant strain. Emotional needs went unmet. Relationships became transactional. Love was present, but conditional, often expressed through expectation rather than affection. The estates held these contradictions quietly. As the children matured, the pressure intensified rather than eased. Achievements raised the bar. Public success increased private scrutiny. The higher the family climbed, the narrower the margin for error became. The estates, once symbols of safety, began to feel like stages where mistakes were amplified rather than forgiven. Joseph Kennedy's stroke removed him physically from daily command, but his system endured unchanged. The family continued operating under rules he had established. No one dismantled them. No one questioned whether they were sustainable. The machinery of legacy continued moving forward, powered by momentum rather than reflection. This rigidity had consequences. When tragedy struck later, the family lacked emotional infrastructure to process it. Grief was managed, not shared. Pain was absorbed, not expressed. The estates that once hosted celebration became places of quiet endurance. Rooms filled with memory rather than conversation. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware. The Kennedy image persisted, confident, composed, unbreakable. The estates reinforced this image visually, even as they strained under the weight of what they contained. The disconnect between perception and reality widened. The family's relationship with risk also evolved within these spaces. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred entitlement. Boundaries blurred. Consequences felt negotiable. The belief that problems could always be handled internally took root. This belief would later prove devastating. Section 3 is not about villainy or blame. It is about design. The Kennedy estates were not neutral backdrops. They were active participants in shaping behavior. They rewarded strength and punished vulnerability. They celebrated achievement and discouraged reflection. They produced leaders and left little room for healing. Joseph Kennedy's legacy is inseparable from this structure. He succeeded beyond measure in building power. What he did not build was resilience of another kind, the capacity to adapt emotionally when control failed. His system assumed permanence. History does not honor such assumptions. As the dynasty expanded, the pressure he created multiplied rather than dispersed. Each new generation inherited not only wealth and opportunity, but unresolved strain. The estates preserved this inheritance faithfully. They passed down expectation as carefully as they passed down property. Understanding this foundation is essential to understanding what followed. The tragedies that would later define the Kennedy narrative did not emerge from chaos. They emerged from a system that prized strength above all else. Even when strength became unsustainable, the Kennedy estates did exactly what they were designed to do. They produced power, visibility, and legacy. What they did not produce was balance. And when balance is absent, collapse does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates quietly until even the strongest structures can no longer hold. This is the architecture beneath the myth. Before the fall, before the violence, before the scandals, there was pressure. And it lived every day behind the gates of the Kennedy estates. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Kennedy estates had evolved into something unprecedented in American life. They were no longer simply private homes or family retreats. They had become stages, carefully arranged environments where power was performed, photographed, and mythologized. The line between domestic space and political theater dissolved almost completely. What unfolded within these walls shaped not only a family's destiny, but the imagination of a nation. Every detail mattered. The placement of furniture, the timing of gatherings, The casualties projected in photographs all were calibrated to communicate confidence without arrogance. The Kennedy estates framed leadership as effortless. Sunlit lawns suggested optimism. Sailboats cutting across blue water implied mastery and youth. The architecture itself became part of the message, refined but not ostentatious. Privileged yet relatable. Hyannisport, Palm Beach, and other Kennedy properties were transformed into backdrops for a new kind of American power. Politics was no longer confined to marble halls and formal chambers. It unfolded in rolled-up sleeves, barefoot conversations, and informal family settings. These images resonated deeply with a public eager for renewal after years of uncertainty. The estates helped sell the idea that leadership could be human, intimate, and modern. Yet this performance required constant maintenance. Behind every relaxed photograph stood hours of preparation. Appearances were choreographed. Guests were selected carefully. Conversations were guided subtly toward desired impressions. Even leisure was strategic. The estates became environments where spontaneity was rehearsed rather than genuine. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Kennedy estates had evolved into something unprecedented in American life. They were no longer simply private homes or family retreats. They had become stages, carefully arranged environments where power was performed, photographed, and mythologized. The line between domestic space and political theater dissolved almost completely. What unfolded within these walls shaped not only a family's destiny, but the imagination of a nation. Every detail mattered. The placement of furniture, the timing of gatherings, the casualties projected in photographs all were calibrated to communicate confidence without arrogance. The Kennedy estates framed leadership as effortless. Sunlit lawns suggested optimism. Sailboats cutting across blue water implied mastery and youth. The architecture itself became part of the message, refined but not ostentatious, privileged yet relatable. Hyannisport, Palm Beach, and other Kennedy properties were transformed into backdrops for a new kind of American power. Politics was no longer confined to marble halls and formal chambers. It unfolded in rolled-up sleeves, barefoot conversations, and informal family settings. These images resonated deeply with a public eager for renewal after years of uncertainty. The estates helped sell the idea that leadership could be human, intimate, and modern. Yet this performance required constant maintenance. Behind every relaxed photograph stood hours of preparation. Appearances were choreographed. Guests were selected carefully. Conversations were guided subtly toward desired impressions. Even leisure was strategic. The estates became environments where spontaneity was rehearsed rather than genuine. For John F. Kennedy, this setting was both asset and burden. The estates amplified his charisma, projecting vitality and control. They helped mask physical pain and medical dependency that few outside the inner circle ever saw. Within these spaces, weakness could be hidden, managed, and reframed. The illusion of vigor was protected at all costs. Jacqueline Kennedy understood the symbolic power of these environments instinctively. She curated not only interiors but atmosphere. Art, culture, and elegance softened the sharp edges of politics. The estates under her influence became extensions of national identity, linking American leadership with European refinement and historical continuity. Camelot was not accidental. It was designed. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Kennedy estates entered a new phase of existence, one defined not by ambition or performance, but by absence. The physical structures remained unchanged, yet their emotional gravity shifted profoundly. Rooms once designed to project confidence now held echoes of loss. The estates no longer looked forward. They looked back. Every staircase, every shoreline, every familiar view became a reminder of what had been taken and what could never be restored. Hyannisport, the emotional heart of the Kennedy world, absorbed this transformation most deeply. It had been the site of childhood competitions, political strategizing, and public imagery carefully crafted to suggest unity and vitality. Now it became a place of retreat, though never of escape. Grief followed the family into every room. The house could not be separated from the memories it contained. Even moments of silence felt heavy, as though the walls themselves carried witness. Jacqueline Kennedy withdrew from these spaces in a way that signaled a broader shift. The estates had helped construct Camelot, but they could not preserve it. Her departure was not merely personal. It was symbolic. The illusion required her presence to survive. Without her, the estates lost their central curator. They became quieter, less performative, stripped of the careful elegance that once defined them. The myth did not die instantly, but it began to fade. For the Kennedy siblings, the loss introduced a new reality. The expectation to rise continued, but now it carried the weight of precedent and fear. The estates became places where grief was revisited rather than resolved. Gatherings were smaller, more subdued. Laughter existed, but it no longer dominated. The sense of invincibility that once permeated these homes had been shattered beyond repair. Robert Kennedy's ascent brought temporary purpose back into these spaces. His presence restored a degree of momentum, but it was different in tone. Where John had embodied ease, Robert carried intensity. The estates once again hosted conversations about justice, power, and national direction, but the mood was darker, more urgent. The optimism of Camelot was replaced by determination edged with anger. Yet the same environments that once amplified hope now magnified risk. The familiarity of the estates reinforced the illusion that danger could be managed, that tragedy was an anomaly rather than a pattern. Security tightened, but emotional exposure remained. The family continued to live publicly, even as the costs of visibility became clearer. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, the Kennedy estates absorbed a second seismic blow. This loss confirmed what the first had suggested. The dynasty was not merely unlucky, it was vulnerable. The repetition transformed grief into something closer to inevitability. The estates, once symbols of ascent, now felt cursed in the public imagination. Hyannisport once again filled with mourners, but the tone had changed. The nation no longer spoke of Camelot. It spoke of tragedy. The houses that had once framed leadership now framed loss. The Kennedy name became inseparable from death, and the estates became landmarks of that association. The impact on family dynamics was profound. Survivors carried guilt alongside grief. The question of who remained and why lingered unspoken. The estates offered no answers. They simply endured, preserving memories without providing relief. The environment that once shaped ambition now shaped restraint. As decades passed, the next generation inherited these spaces along with their weight. The estates were no longer launching points for power. They were reminders of what power could not prevent. Younger Kennedys grew up surrounded by legacy but constrained by it. Expectation remained, but confidence did not. The estates became quieter still. Public gatherings decreased. The family's relationship with the media grew more cautious. The houses that once invited cameras now discouraged them. Privacy, once irrelevant, became essential. The illusion of openness had proven dangerous. Meanwhile, the public continued to romanticize the Kennedy past. The estates existed simultaneously as private spaces of mourning and public symbols of nostalgia. This duality created tension. The family could never fully reclaim these homes as personal sanctuaries. They belonged too much to history. Tragedy continued to follow the name. Accidents, scandals, and early deaths reinforced the sense of decline. Each incident echoed through the estates, reinforcing the narrative of loss. The spaces did not cause these events, but they recorded them. Their continuity made the pattern impossible to ignore. Over time, the Kennedy estates became less about presence and more about preservation. They stood as physical evidence of a dynasty that once promised permanence. The architecture remained impressive, but its meaning had inverted. Grandeur now emphasized fragility rather than strength. Section 5 represents the long middle descent. Not a single fall, but a sustained unraveling. The Kennedy estates did not collapse dramatically. They endured quietly as the family's central myth eroded piece by piece. Each loss stripped away another layer of belief. The tragedy was not merely the deaths themselves, but the transformation of space. Homes that once nurtured ambition became vessels for memory. Places designed to inspire now instructed caution. The estates taught the surviving family members that legacy could be a burden heavier than any material inheritance. In these years, the Kennedy name remained powerful, but it was no longer aspirational in the same way. The estates no longer symbolized the future. They symbolized endurance. Survival replaced ascent as the primary narrative. The fall of the Kennedy estates was not architectural. It was emotional and symbolic. They remained standing, but what they represented had fundamentally changed. Camelot had promised continuity. Reality delivered repetition of loss. By the end of this period, the dynasty no longer felt suspended between greatness and potential. It felt anchored to history, unable to move forward without dragging the weight of what had been lost. The estates, once instruments of power, had become monuments to the cost of living in full view of a nation. This is where the tragedy deepens. Not in a single moment of violence, but in the realization that there would be no return to innocence. No restoration of the original promise. The Kennedy estates would continue to exist, but only as echoes of a vision that could not survive the world it helped shape. By the time the nation entered the late 20th century, the Kennedy estates had become places of contradiction. They were still outwardly beautiful, still carefully maintained, still surrounded by water and privilege, yet they no longer functioned as centers of power in the way they once had. Instead, they existed as holding spaces, repositories of memory, expectation, and unresolved tension. The dynasty had not disappeared, but it had fractured, and the estates reflected that fragmentation with quiet precision. Hyannis Port remained the symbolic core, but its meaning had evolved. Once a stage for youthful confidence and political choreography, it now felt restrained, almost guarded. Family gatherings continued, but they were no longer spontaneous. Every arrival carried awareness. Every departure carried relief. The house that once welcomed the press as an extension of public life now resisted attention. Curtains closed more often. Conversations lowered. The estate had learned caution. The next generation grew up inside these walls under a different set of rules. They inherited not only wealth and access, but a reputation shaped by loss. The stories of assassinations, scandals, and sudden deaths were not distant history to them. They were family lore, whispered in hallways and carried into adulthood. The estates did not shield them from this awareness. They intensified it. Every photograph on the wall served as a reminder of both greatness and fragility. With time, the pressure that once pushed Kennedys toward public service began to collide with a growing desire for privacy. Some members still pursued political or social influence, but the certainty that had once accompanied such ambition was gone. The estates no longer felt like launch pads. They felt like boundaries. Crossing into public life meant inviting comparison, scrutiny, and risk forces that history had proven unforgiving. The physical continuity of the estates created an illusion of stability that the family itself no longer possessed. The buildings did not age in the same way the myth did. Lawns remained trimmed. Rooms were restored. Boats still cut through familiar waters. Yet beneath this surface maintenance lay an emotional fatigue that could not be renovated away. The effort to preserve the past had begun to interfere with the ability to imagine a future. Public fascination intensified even as the family withdrew. The Kennedy estates became pilgrimage sites in the national imagination, symbols people wanted to understand, photograph, and decode. Camelot, though long gone, refused to die in public memory. This created an uneasy dynamic. The family lived inside places that no longer belonged entirely to them. Ownership had become shared with history, and history did not respect privacy. Scandals during this era reinforced the sense that the dynasty was unraveling in slow motion. Personal struggles, legal issues, and moral failures were magnified by the Kennedy name and by the spaces associated with it. When missteps occurred, they echoed louder because they were perceived as betrayals of a myth that had never been entirely real. The estates absorbed these moments too, quietly adding them to the growing archive of disappointment. Unlike earlier tragedies, These incidents did not shock the nation into grief. Instead, they confirmed an expectation. The idea of the Kennedy curse, once spoken cautiously, now circulated openly. The estates became backdrops to that narrative, places where fate seemed to linger. Even rational observers could not entirely separate coincidence from symbolism. The repetition had become too consistent. Within the family, relationships shifted under this weight. Unity, once enforced by shared ambition, became harder to sustain. Distance replaced closeness. Some members visited the estates out of obligation rather than comfort. Others avoided them altogether, choosing lives far removed from the shadows of legacy. Absence became another form of inheritance. The estates themselves began to feel emotionally segmented. Certain rooms carried heavier associations than others. Certain seasons brought discomfort. Summer, once the height of vitality, now resurrected memories that could not be controlled. The cyclical nature of return, same places, same views, same rituals reinforced a sense of being trapped inside history rather than guided by it. Attempts to modernize or reframe the estates met quiet resistance. Change felt risky. Altering too much seemed like erasing memory. Altering too little felt like surrendering to stagnation. The family navigated this tension cautiously, aware that every decision carried symbolic weight beyond its practical impact. Even renovation became a philosophical question. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. The political and cultural environment that had once elevated the Kennedys no longer existed. Media had grown more invasive, less forgiving. The romanticism of elite families had eroded. Transparency was demanded, and privilege was increasingly questioned. The estates, once assets in shaping public image, now offered little protection. The Kennedy name still opened doors, but it no longer guaranteed reverence. The estates no longer impressed in the same way. They were admired, but also scrutinized. People wanted to know what had gone wrong inside them. The question was no longer how such greatness was built, but why it could not be sustained. This shift marked a crucial turning point. The fall of the Kennedy estates was no longer defined by loss alone, but by irrelevance creeping in quietly. The dynasty had not been destroyed. It had been diluted. Influence spread thin. Authority softened. The estates, once command centers of national imagination, now stood on the periphery of it. Yet they did not disappear. They endured, stubborn and unchanged, resisting the finality that history seemed to demand. In doing so, they preserved the contradiction at the heart of the Kennedy story. Immense continuity paired with undeniable decline. Presence without power. Legacy without direction. Section 6 represents the long aftermath, the era where tragedy no longer shocks but lingers. Where decline is not dramatic but persistent. The Kennedy estates, by remaining intact, forced the family and the nation to confront an uncomfortable truth. That survival is not the same as triumph. And memory is not the same as meaning. These homes had outlasted presidents, movements, and myths. But endurance came at a cost. The longer they stood, the clearer it became that they were no longer symbols of ascent. They were mirrors, reflecting what happens when a family becomes larger than the lives inside it. In this phase, the tragedy was no longer about what was taken suddenly, but about what was slowly lost. Momentum, confidence, the belief that the future would naturally resemble the past. The estates had once promised continuity. Now they offered only perspective, a reminder that even the most powerful stories eventually reach a point where holding on becomes harder than letting go. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Kennedy estates entered a period defined less by crisis and more by reckoning. The dramatic losses that once dominated headlines had receded into history, but their consequences remained embedded in the walls of the family's most iconic homes. What replaced shock was reflection. The estates no longer served as stages for ambition or even retreat. They became spaces where the family confronted what their legacy had become, and what, if anything, could still be shaped from it. Hyannisport remained central, not because of power, but because of gravity. It was the place where the past felt closest, where the lineage could not be abstracted or softened by distance. Every return carried emotional complexity. The familiarity was comforting, but it was also confining. The house held too many stories to allow neutrality. To step inside was to engage with the full weight of what had occurred there across generations. By this point, the Kennedy name functioned more as a historical reference than a living force. Younger family members grew up aware of their ancestry but increasingly disconnected from its original purpose. The estates became educational environments rather than inspirational ones. Children learned about expectation, caution, and consequence before they learned about possibility. The message was implicit but clear. Legacy could offer opportunity, but it could also narrow the range of acceptable choices. This internal shift mirrored a broader cultural change. America's relationship with political dynasties had grown skeptical. The idea that leadership could be inherited lost its appeal. Transparency replaced mystique. The mythology that once protected the Kennedys no longer resonated in the same way. As a result, the estates lost their role as symbols of national identity. They became historical artifacts, admired but distant. The family adapted unevenly to this new reality. Some members embraced anonymity, choosing professions and lifestyles far removed from politics or public expectation. Others attempted to redefine service through philanthropy, advocacy, or quieter forms of influence. The estates provided space for these choices, but they no longer directed them. Authority had diffused. The emotional architecture of the estates reflected this transition. Rooms once associated with power now felt ceremonial. They existed for memory rather than function. Family gatherings became more intentional, less frequent, and more private. The performative aspect of unity faded. Authenticity replaced spectacle, but at the cost of visibility. At the same time, the public continued to project meaning onto these spaces. Documentaries, books, and retrospectives revisited the estates repeatedly, searching for explanations. Why here? Why this family? Why so much loss? The houses themselves became evidence in an unresolvable case. Their endurance suggested continuity, but their silence offered no clarity. This constant reinterpretation created a subtle tension. The family could not fully control how their spaces were understood. The estates existed simultaneously as homes and as symbols open to public judgment. Decisions about preservation, access, and representation carried moral and emotional weight. Every choice risked misinterpretation. Efforts to contextualize the Kennedy story became more deliberate during this period. Archives expanded. Narratives diversified. The focus shifted from glorification to complexity. The estates played a role in this reframing by standing as reminders that greatness and failure are not opposites, but companions. They demonstrated how ambition, when sustained across generations, can magnify both achievement and vulnerability. Within the family, conversations about the future of these properties became unavoidable. What should be preserved? What should be shared? What should be allowed to fade? The estates could not remain static forever. Their upkeep demanded purpose. Their symbolism demanded responsibility. Yet no single answer satisfied all stakeholders. The idea of letting go, once unthinkable, entered the conversation quietly. Not abandonment, but transformation. The possibility that the estates might serve history more than family began to take shape. This notion was emotionally charged. To relinquish control felt like conceding defeat. To retain it felt like prolonging stagnation. The estates themselves seemed to resist resolution. Their beauty persisted. Their presence commanded respect, but they no longer offered direction. They waited. This waiting defined the era. A pause between what had been and what might follow, without certainty that renewal was possible. Public memory continued to simplify the Kennedy story even as internal understanding grew more nuanced. The estates bore the burden of that simplification. They were photographed, referenced, and revisited as shorthand for an era that defied easy summary. Their stillness contrasted sharply with the chaos they had witnessed. This phase of the dynasty was quieter, but no less significant. It marked the moment when survival was no longer the goal. Meaning was The estates forced the family to ask not how to continue, but why. What purpose did these spaces serve in a world that no longer needed symbols of inherited power? For some, the answer lay in preservation and education. For others, in privacy and distance. The lack of consensus mirrored the fragmentation of the dynasty itself. Unity had once been imposed by ambition. Now, autonomy took precedence. Section 7 captures this moment of reflection. Not collapse, but uncertainty. Not tragedy, but transition. The Kennedy estates stood intact, but their future was unresolved. They had outlived their original function and now demanded reinterpretation. The true fall in this stage was internal. The realization that legacy could not be restored, only recontextualized. That the story could not be reclaimed from history, only shared with it. The estates, by refusing to disappear, compelled that realization. In the end, these homes were no longer about what they once promised. They were about what they could still teach. About restraint. About consequence. About the cost of myth-making when reality refuses to cooperate. The Kennedy estates did not crumble. They endured, asking a quieter but more difficult question. What remains when belief fades? But memory does not dot. By the time the Kennedy estates entered the modern era, their meaning had shifted yet again. What once functioned as living environments shaped by power and expectation had gradually become sites of interpretation. They were no longer just inhabited. They were examined. Historians, journalists, and the public approached these places not as homes, but as keys, physical spaces believed to unlock answers about a family that had come to symbolize both America's highest hopes and its most persistent disappointments. This transformation was subtle but decisive. The estates did not announce their new role. They drifted into it as the distance between myth and memory widened. With each passing year, fewer people remained who had lived inside Camelot at its height. First-hand experience gave way to second-hand recollection, and recollection gave way to narrative. The homes became reference points rather than centers of action. Hyannisport, still carefully maintained, now existed in a state of controlled visibility. It was neither fully private nor entirely public. It stood in a gray zone, protected yet perpetually observed. The family understood that the estate had outgrown them. It belonged to a national story that no longer required their permission to be told. This realization altered the relationship between place and ownership in a profound way. The Kennedy estates had become mirrors rather than engines. Visitors, scholars, and viewers projected their own interpretations onto them. To some, these homes represented the promise of public service corrupted by excess and secrecy. To others, they remained symbols of sacrifice and commitment, proof that idealism carried real cost. The estates themselves did not argue. They absorbed every reading in silence. Inside the family, the weight of interpretation created a new kind of pressure. Earlier generations had lived under the demand to perform greatness. This generation lived under the demand to explain it. Questions replaced expectations. Why did this family rise so quickly? Why did it fall so publicly? Why did tragedy return so often? The estates, once backdrops for confidence, now framed uncertainty. This era saw a shift in how legacy was managed. Rather than extending influence, the family focused on containment. Not of scandal, but of meaning. They attempted to ensure that the story would not be reduced to caricature or superstition. The so-called curse, long sensationalized, was increasingly challenged by context. The estates became evidence not of fate, but of environment, of how pressure, exposure, and ambition compound over time. Yet, even this reframing carried limitations. No amount of analysis could fully separate place from outcome. The repetition of loss remained too stark. The estates had witnessed too many endings to be understood as neutral settings. They were participants, not perpetrators, but they shaped behavior by shaping belief. To grow up within them was to internalize a sense of exceptionality that proved difficult to reconcile with ordinary. Vulnerability, public engagement with the estates, intensified through media that blurred the line between education and entertainment. Documentaries and retrospectives lingered on architecture, landscapes and interiors as though searching for clues hidden in design. Viewers were invited to imagine conversations held in specific rooms, decisions made along specific shorelines. The spaces were treated almost as characters, their stillness contrasted against the chaos they had once contained. This fascination revealed something deeper about American culture. The Kennedy estates endured not simply because of who lived in them, but because they embodied a question the country still struggled to answer. Can idealism survive proximity to power? The houses did not provide answers, but they framed the question with extraordinary clarity. For the family, this period demanded careful boundary setting. How much access was appropriate? How much interpretation could be tolerated? Complete withdrawal was impossible. Total openness felt unsafe. The estates existed in between, their meaning negotiated rather than defined. This ambiguity reflected the broader uncertainty surrounding the Kennedy legacy itself. Meanwhile, the passage of time softened certain edges. Distance allowed for complexity. Earlier narratives of heroism and downfall evolved into discussions of systems, privilege, and consequence. The estates supported this shift by remaining visible but restrained. They did not demand reverence. They invited examination. Internally, this era brought a quieter form of acceptance. Not resolution but acknowledgement. The family recognized that the past could not be edited. The estates would always carry associations beyond their control. What could be shaped was the tone of engagement. The goal was no longer preservation of myth, but stewardship of history. This stewardship reframed the estates as educational spaces in the broadest sense. Not classrooms but context. They taught without instruction. Their architecture demonstrated scale. Their continuity demonstrated endurance. Their unchanged presence demonstrated how little time alters meaning once it has been fixed in the public imagination. At the same time, the estates revealed the limits of legacy. They showed that buildings can survive what narratives cannot. That material continuity does not guarantee ideological relevance. The Kennedys remained influential in certain spheres, but the estates no longer amplified that influence. They stood apart from contemporary power, observing rather than directing. This separation marked a quiet liberation. Without the obligation to embody the future, the estates could finally exist as records of the past. The pressure to perform greatness dissolved into the responsibility to remember honestly. This shift did not erase pain, but it reduced distortion. Section 8 captures this stage of reinterpretation. The moment when the Kennedy estates stopped functioning as symbols of destiny and became symbols of inquiry. They no longer asked the nation to believe. They asked it to reflect. In this phase, the tragedy was not renewed, but reframed. Loss was no longer sensationalized. It was contextualized. The estates became tools for understanding rather than monuments to mourning. This silence, once oppressive, now felt instructive. What remained was a quieter truth. That the fall of the Kennedy estates was never about decay or abandonment. It was about transformation. About a shift from myth to meaning, from aspiration to analyses. The homes endured because they had something unresolved to say. They stood as reminders that history does not conclude neatly. It lingers in places, waiting for perspective to catch up. The Kennedy estates, stripped of illusion, but rich with memory, became sites where America could confront its own contradictions, idealism and ambition, power and vulnerability, hope and consequence without the comfort of simple answers. And in that raw, they finally found a form of permanence that myth alone could never sustain. As the Kennedy estates moved deeper into the present century, they entered a final, complex phase one defined not by the family's actions, but by how the world continued to respond to their absence from power. The houses still stood, immaculate and deliberate, yet the dynasty that once animated them no longer shaped national direction. What remained was a space between reverence and release, where history lingered but authority had quietly withdrawn. The estates now existed primarily as memory structures. Their physical continuity contrasted sharply with the erosion of the influence once exercised within their walls. Time had not diminished their beauty, but it had altered their relevance. They were no longer places where decisions were made that would ripple outward across the nation. Instead, they were places where decisions had once been made and that distinction mattered. The difference between living power and remembered power defined this stage of the story. Hyannis Port, once synonymous with American leadership, had become something closer to a boundary marker. It delineated an era rather than directing a future. Visitors and observers approached it with a sense of retrospection, not anticipation. The estate was no longer a signal of what was coming next, but of what had already passed. In that shift, the myth of Camelot finally settled into history. This transition exposed the ultimate limitation of legacy. Influence, no matter how profound, does not remain transferable indefinitely. The Kennedy estates demonstrated this truth with unusual clarity. They showed how power tied too tightly to a single family becomes vulnerable once the conditions that sustained it disappear. The cultural moment that elevated the Kennedys had changed irrevocably. The estates remained, but the context that gave them authority did not. For the family, this period required a delicate reckoning. Without the burden of expectation to lead nationally, there was also the loss of purpose that had once unified them. The estates no longer demanded performance, but they also no longer provided direction. Members of the family navigated this ambiguity individually, forging identities disconnected from the spaces that once defined them. This decentralization diluted the symbolic weight of the estates even further. Where once they represented cohesion, they now reflected dispersion. The Kennedy story fractured into multiple narratives, none dominant enough to reclaim the authority of the past. The estates in turn became neutral ground places of origin rather than command. Public perception adapted accordingly. The fascination did not disappear, but it softened. The Kennedy name retained recognition, yet it no longer provoked the same emotional intensity. The estates were still referenced, still photographed, still studied, but the tone had shifted from longing to analysis. The question was no longer what the Kennedys might do next, but what their story revealed about the American relationship with power itself. In this sense, the estates achieved a different kind of relevance. They became case studies. They illustrated how myth is constructed, sustained, and eventually outgrown. They demonstrated the consequences of elevating a family into a symbol, and the inevitability of disillusionment when reality intrudes. The tragedy was no longer personal. It was structural. The physical stillness of the estates amplified this realization. Their unchanged appearance emphasized how little architecture can do to preserve influence once belief erodes. The houses had been meticulously cared for, but no amount of maintenance could restore the conditions that once made them central to national imagination. Preservation ensured survival, not significance. This distinction reshaped the legacy entirely. The Kennedy estates were no longer aspirational. They were instructional. They taught that continuity of place does not equal continuity of power. That memory can outlast relevance. That endurance can coexist with decline. Internally, this understanding brought a measure of peace. Without the pressure to live up to an impossible ideal, the family could finally relate to the estates without performance. The houses became personal again, if only partially. Their role as stages had diminished. Their role as shelters, though complicated, re-emerged. Yet the public dimension never fully receded. The estates remained embedded in the national psyche, their meaning negotiated anew by each generation. This perpetual reinterpretation ensured that the story would never fully conclude. The estates resisted closure by existing so visibly, so stubbornly, in the present. What distinguished this final phase was the absence of urgency. Earlier periods were driven by ambition, crisis, or survival. This one was defined by stillness. The dynasty no longer raced toward a future or retreated from a tragedy. It simply remained, its outlines clear, its center hollowed. The fall of the Kennedy estates in this sense was complete, not because they were lost, but because they no longer needed to be defended. Their decline had stabilized into acceptance. The myth had been replaced by understanding. The story had slowed enough to be examined without distortion. This acceptance extended beyond the family. America, too, had moved on. The nation's focus shifted to new figures, new narratives, new conflicts. The Kennedys became part of a broader historical tapestry rather than its focal point. The estates remained visible, but they no longer competed for attention. Their power had been absorbed into context. And yet, their endurance ensured that the lessons they embodied could not be ignored. The estates continued to illustrate the cost of public idealism concentrated within private lives. They reminded observers that leadership carries exposure, that myth invites scrutiny, and that no family, no matter how elevated, can remain untouched by consequence. Section 9 represents this quiet conclusion. Not an ending marked by collapse, but by equilibrium. The Kennedy estates settled into their final role, not as engines of history, but as its witnesses. They stood as proof that the most profound falls are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are gradual, dignified, and irreversible. The tragedy of the Kennedy estates was never that they failed to endure. It was that they endured long enough to reveal the limits of endurance itself. They survived ambition, violence, scandal, and time. What they could not survive was belief without renewal. In the end, the estates did not vanish. They remained unchanged in form, transformed in meaning. They no longer promised greatness. They offered perspective. And in that offering, the story of their fall reached its most honest expression, not as a spectacle of loss, but as a study in how power fades, how myth dissolves, and how history, once complete, simply waits to be understood. In the final chapter of the Kennedy estate story, what remains is not a question of loss or decline, but of legacy's ultimate destination. After ambition has burned out, after tragedy has repeated itself, after public fascination has softened into historical distance, these places still exist. They stand at the intersection of memory and meaning, no longer demanding belief, yet still refusing irrelevance. The estates endure not as symbols of what America hoped for, but as reflections of what it learned. By this stage, the Kennedy homes have fully crossed from lived environments into cultural landmarks. They are not frozen in time, but they are no longer driven by it. Their presence is calm, almost contemplative. The noise that once surrounded them, campaigns, crises, cameras, has faded. What remains is a quiet authority born not from power but from experience. These structures have outlasted the myth that created them. The fall of the Kennedy estates was never about physical decay. It was about the gradual separation of place from purpose. These homes were built to house a future that never fully arrived. When that future collapsed, the buildings remained, forced to adapt to a role they were never designed for. Over time, they became vessels for reflection rather than instruments of action. In this final phase, the estates invite a different kind of attention. They do not demand admiration. They provoke questions. How did a family come to carry so much national meaning? Why did that meaning concentrate so intensely in specific places? And what happens when those places outlive the story they were meant to sustain? The answers are not located in any single event, but in the accumulation of moments that shaped both family and nation. For the Kennedy family, this period represents a release, not from history, which remains inescapable, but from the obligation to embody it. The estates no longer function as stages upon which the family must perform legacy. They exist as inherited spaces, complex and imperfect, carrying both pride and pain without demanding resolution. Ownership has become stewardship rather than destiny. This shift allows the story to widen. The Kennedy estates no longer belong exclusively to one family narrative. They belong to a broader American reflection on power, idealism, and consequence. They reveal how quickly hope can harden into expectation, and how expectation, when unmet, transforms into disappointment. The homes did not cause this arc. They witnessed it. The endurance of these estates underscores a central truth about history. Places remember differently than people do. Individuals reinterpret the past through emotion and perspective. Buildings hold it without judgment. They preserve scale, proximity, and continuity. The Kennedy homes retain the proportions of ambition and the closeness of consequence in a way no written record can fully capture. In this sense, the estates become moral spaces. They do not instruct, but they caution. They demonstrate how power magnifies vulnerability, how visibility invites pressure, and how myth can become a burden heavier than any private grief. These lessons are not specific to one family. They resonate far beyond the Kennedy name. The story ends not with disappearance, but with permanence of a different kind. The estates remain present, but their role is settled. They will not rise again as centers of national imagination. They do not need to. Their value lies in their ability to hold contradiction without collapsing under it. They stand as reminders that greatness is not self-sustaining, and that legacy, once established, cannot be controlled. America's relationship with the Kennedy estates has matured. The longing that once surrounded them has given way to understanding. The desire to believe has been replaced by the willingness to learn. This evolution mirrors the broader national journey away from mythic leadership toward accountability and complexity. The final tragedy, if it can be called that, is not that Camelot ended, but that it was ever expected to last. The estates reveal the cost of placing timeless ideals inside temporary lives. They show that even the most carefully constructed visions are vulnerable to time, chance, and human limitation, and yet there is dignity in what remains. The Kennedy estates have not been reduced to ruins or relics. They are maintained, respected, and contextualized. They have achieved a form of balance. They no longer promise salvation, but they offer clarity. In closing, the tragic fall of the Kennedy estates is not a story of collapse, but of transformation. From ambition to loss. From myth to memory. From power to perspective. These places did not fail. They fulfilled their role in the only way history allows, by revealing, over time, the limits of even the most powerful stories. The estates stand today not as warnings, but as witnesses. They remind us that legacy is not measured by how long influence lasts, but by what understanding remains after it fades. And in that quiet, enduring presence, the Kennedy estates have found their final meaning, not as monuments to what was lost, but as reflections of what was learned.